The screen is black. We hear the rhythmic, metallic thrum, thrum, thrum of a heartbeat. Not a human one, but the mechanical vibration of a Pratt & Whitney engine. 4:12 p.m. Edwards Air Force Base. The tarmac is 114 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cockpit of the XF-22 Spectre Bolt, Cade Holloway's heart rate is a steady 62 BPM. He trusts the $200 million machine. He trusts the 4,000 hours of engineering. He is wrong. 15 feet behind his spine, a fuel bypass line is screaming. The internal temperature has just crossed 1,100 degrees Celsius. The illegal composite bond holding the line together is rated for 800 degrees Celsius. It is no longer a solid. It is a pressurized liquid bubbling against the vibrating titanium. The odds of structural disintegration? 88%. The time to ignition? 42 seconds. The cost of a shortcut? Total. The Pentagon called it the unflyable solution. The Soviets called it a ghost. But to the men in the 412th Test Wing, it was just a headache that wouldn't stop breaking. They tried the elite engineers from MIT. They tried a $40 million redesign of the SEAL housing. They tried grounding the fleet for 6 months of simulation. Everything failed. The project was 48 hours from being scrapped, until they gave the wrench to a man who didn't have a degree, but had the touch. Before we look at the 30-cent mistake that almost rewrote Cold War history, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. We're deep diving into the grease-stained records of aviation's most dangerous secrets. This is the story of Ray "Rusty" Miller. He wasn't a scientist. He was a Kansas farm boy who learned to listen to metal before he learned to read a blueprint. And in the summer of '84, his street smarts almost triggered a national catastrophe. The vibration didn't start as a shudder. It started as a hum, a frequency so low it felt more like a premonition in Cade Flash Holloway's teeth than a mechanical failure. At 50,000 feet, the sky isn't blue. It's a deep, bruised purple, and the air is too thin to forgive a mistake. Holloway adjusted the oxygen mask against his face, watching the digital horizon of the XF-22 Spectre Bolt. He was pushing Mach 1.8, the twin turbines behind him, screaming in a synchronized, violent harmony. Then, the harmony broke. In the cockpit, a single amber light flickered on the master caution panel. Bypass temp. Within 3 seconds, it didn't just turn red. It began to pulse. The temperature in the engine nacelle was climbing at a rate of 50 degrees per second. Holloway throttled back, but the vibration intensified. A rhythmic thump, thump, thump that felt like a sledgehammer hitting the floorboards. "Center, this is Ghost 1. Holloway's voice was clipped, professional, masking the adrenaline spike. "I've got a thermal runaway in Engine 2. EGT is off the charts. I'm seeing airframe oscillation, requesting immediate descent." 10 miles below, in the air-conditioned silence of the telemetry trailer, Ray "Rusty" Miller sat hunched over a flickering monitor. While the military brass stared at the radar arc, Rusty was looking at the raw sensor feed from the fuel bypass line. His stomach dropped into his oil-stained boots. He didn't need a computer to tell him what was happening. He could see the pressure dropping in the secondary line, the exact line he had secured 48 hours ago with a bead of unrated industrial composite. In his mind's eye, Rusty saw the bond. At 1,200 degrees Celsius, the adhesive wouldn't just fail, it would turn into a lubricant. The high-pressure titanium seal, deprived of its grip, would be vibrating like a reed in a hurricane. Every time the Spectre bolt's engines pulsed, that seal was backing out, millimeter by agonizing millimeter. "Flash, get the nose down," Rusty muttered under his breath, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the console. Through the comms, he heard the roar of the cockpit environment, the heavy breathing of a pilot fighting G-forces, and the haunting sound of metal screaming under thermal stress. Rusty knew the math that the eggheads didn't. If that seal backed out another 3 millimeters, the pressurized fuel would atomize instantly against the white-hot turbine blades. The Spectre bolt wouldn't just crash, it would vanish in a chemical flash. "He's losing hydraulic pressure," a technician shouted. Rusty closed his eyes, the scent of hydraulic fluid and burnt sugar filling his memory. He had built the deadliest plane in the world, and now he was listening to it melt from the inside out. "Punch it, Cade," he whispered to the empty air. "Eject before the seal gives." But on the screen, the Spectre bolt remained a steady, flickering dot, descending into the thick, hot air that would either cool the engine or provide the final spark for the funeral pyre. To understand the man who nearly broke the Air Force, you have to understand the dirt he came from. Ray Rusty Miller didn't learn thermodynamics from a textbook. He learned it from the heat waves shimmering off a stalled John Deere in a 1952 Kansas dust storm. By the age of 12, he could strip a transmission in a pitch-black barn by feel alone, identifying worn gears by the smell of the oil clinging to them. To Rusty, machinery wasn't a collection of parts. It was a living, breathing organism that spoke in rattles, pings, and vibrations. If an engine had a heartbeat, Rusty was its surgeon. He carried that grease-stained intuition from the Dust Bowl to the high-security hangars of Groom Lake. While the junior engineers arrived with polished slide rules and pocket protectors, Rusty arrived with a scarred metal toolbox and a permanent crescent of black carbon under his fingernails. He was a ghost in the machine, a man who treated a $200 million stealth turbine with the same rough pragmatism he'd used on a rusted thresher. He didn't care about the theory of flight. He cared about the reality of friction. This was exactly why Dr. Lawrence Thorne, the lead architect of the Spectre bolt, and a man who held 3 PhDs in aeronautical engineering, wouldn't let anyone else touch the XF-22's propulsion system. Thorne was a man of cold equations, but he knew that math had limits. He had watched 3 certified specialists strip the threading on a critical turbine housing because they followed the manual instead of the metal. Thorne realized then that the Spectre bolt was too complex for a standard technician. It needed someone who understood the temperament of the alloys. The relationship between the elite scientist and the Kansas mechanic was an uneasy alliance of necessity. Thorne provided the vision, but Rusty provided the pulse. Whenever a prototype vibrated at Mach 1.2 or a fuel pump cavitated under high G loads, Thorne didn't call the board of directors. He walked down to the hangar floor where Rusty was usually found, elbow deep in a nacelle. "What's it telling you, Ray?" Thorne would ask. Rusty would wipe his hands on a rag, listen to the cooling metal hiss, and point to a bolt the size of a thumbnail. "She's tight on the intake, Doc. Give her 2 microns of breathing room, or she'll snap at altitude." It was this absolute, terrifying competence that gave Rusty his legend and his arrogance. He had spent a lifetime fixing what the eggheads broke. By the time the Spectre bolt sat on the tarmac with a failed titanium seal and a 48-hour deadline, Rusty didn't see a safety protocol. He saw another problem that only his illegal intuition could solve. The XF-22 Spectre bolt wasn't just a plane. It was an act of industrial defiance. While the Soviet MiG-29s were built like iron hammers, rugged, heavy, and predictable, the Spectre Bolt was a scalpel forged from exotic alloys that shouldn't have existed. It was designed to do the impossible: cruise at Mach 2.4 without afterburners, and turn with a violent agility that would snap a human pilot's spine if the fly-by-wire system didn't intervene. It was a predatory ghost, its skin coated in radar-absorbent materials that turned a 40-ton fighter into the signature of a small bird on enemy screens. But the true heart of its lethality lay in its twin-engine core, a masterpiece of propulsion that pushed the laws of physics to their absolute breaking point. The engine was a high-bypass turbofan designed to operate at temperatures that would liquefy standard steel. To handle the inferno, the engineers utilized a revolutionary titanium matrix composite for the primary fuel seals. These seals were the gatekeepers. They held back the highly pressurized JP7 fuel from the 1,200 degrees Celsius combustion gases. The tolerances were measured in microns, 1/50th the width of a human hair. If the seal held, the Spectre Bolt was the deadliest weapon in history. If it moved, the engine became a pipe bomb. The problem was the titanium seal itself. It was a proprietary, 3-stage interlocking ring that required a specific chemical vapor deposition process to seat correctly. It was brilliant on a blueprint, but a nightmare in the hangar. The seal was notoriously brittle, sensitive to the slightest thermal shock during ground tests. During the final high-stress run before the Washington demonstration, the seal in Engine 2 didn't just leak, it shattered. In any other era, the fix would be simple: pull the engine, wait for a replacement part from the specialized foundry in Ohio, and reschedule. But the Spectre Bolt didn't have the luxury of time. The Soviets were moving divisions toward the border, and the corporate board at Blackwell Aerospace was staring at $1 billion deficit. A 2-week delay for a back-ordered seal meant the death of the project. The aircraft was a Ferrari with a broken fuel cap, a masterpiece of 21st century warfare rendered useless by a single, palm-sized ring of metal. It was a technical dead end that left the military brass desperate and Dr. Thorne paralyzed. They needed a miracle or a cheat. Rusty Miller was already looking for his glue. The climate inside Hangar 4 didn't come from the desert heat. It came from the arrival of the suits and the stars. Cyrus Blackwell, the CEO of Blackwell Aerospace, walked across the concrete floor like a man inspecting his own tomb. Behind him, General Stone Hardaway trailed with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a commander who had already traded lives for time. They didn't look at the mechanics. They looked at the Spectre Bolt, which sat eviscerated, its engine cowling splayed open like a metallic rib cage. To Blackwell, the plane was a sinking ledger of debt. To Hardaway, it was the only shield against a Soviet surge that was already redlining the map. Blackwell stopped 3 feet from Rusty, his expensive leather shoes stepping over a puddle of hydraulic fluid without a flinch. He didn't offer a hand. "The board is meeting in 48 hours, Ray," Blackwell said, his voice a cold, corporate rasp. "If this bird isn't in the air for the DC delegation by Monday morning, the funding evaporates. We lose the contract, the factory closes, and this project becomes a historical footnote about expensive failures." He looked up at the $200 million airframe. "I don't want to hear about back-ordered parts. I want to hear the engine start." General Hardaway stepped forward, his shadow engulfing Rusty's workbench. He didn't care about the money. "Miller, I've got pilots sitting in ready rooms in West Germany who are flying kites against cannons," Hardaway growled. "Every day this plane sits on a jack stand is another day we lose the edge. The Pentagon needs a win. The country needs this plane. If it doesn't fly by Monday, I'm recommending we scrap the X program and pivot to a cheaper, slower alternative. The ultimatum was a binary choice: fly or die. There was no middle ground, no room for the 2-week lead time required for a new titanium seal. Dr. Thorne stood in the corner, his face pale, his eyes fixed on a clipboard full of impossible equations. He knew the physics wouldn't budge. He knew the seal was a catastrophic failure point that no amount of political pressure could weld back together. But Rusty didn't look at the general, and he didn't look at the CEO. He looked at the gaping hole in the Spectre bolt's nacelle. He felt the weight of the thousands of jobs in Kansas, the lives of the pilots in Germany, and the legacy of the machine he had helped breathe life into. The pressure was a physical force, a vice tightening around the hangar. Blackwell and Hardaway turned and walked away, leaving the silence of a death sentence behind them. Rusty reached into the back of his tool chest, his fingers brushing against a dusty, unlabeled canister of industrial composite he'd kept since his days in the motor pool. The illegal fix was no longer a theory. It was the only way out. The hangar at 2 a.m. was a cathedral of cold, fluorescent light and hollow echoes. The suits were asleep in their 5-star hotels, and Chief Inspector Silas Grimm was 2 miles away at the base mess hall. Fueled by black coffee and bureaucracy, Rusty stood alone under the belly of the Spectre bolt, the silence amplified by the ticking of cooling metal. In his hand was a plain, unbranded canister of C400 structural adhesive. It was a heavy-duty composite designed for bonding armor plating on M1 Abrams tanks. Tough, stubborn, and never, under any circumstances, meant to be used on a supersonic turbine. Rusty knew the risks better than any man alive. Tank armor stayed cool. Jet engines became blast furnaces. The C400 was a street-smart solution, a chemical shortcut he had used back in Kansas to patch tractor blocks that should have been scrapped. It could withstand a 100-ton impact, but it wasn't rated for the 1,200 degrees Celsius thermal expansion of a titanium fuel bypass. If the bond held, he was a genius who saved the program. If it turned to glass and shattered at Mach 2, he was a saboteur. With a surgical precision that masked his trembling hands, Rusty began the one illegal work. He didn't use the digital torque wrenches or the laser alignment tools required by the manual. Instead, he used a custom ground shim and his own fingers to feel the seat of the broken seal. He applied a thin, translucent bead of the C400 around the fractured titanium ring, pressing it into place with a steady, rhythmic pressure. The chemical scent of the adhesive was sharp, biting through the smell of JP7 fuel like a warning. He worked in the shadows of the nacelle, keeping his flashlight dimmed to a sliver. Every footfall on the hangar floor made his heart kick against his ribs. He wasn't just bypassing a seal. He was bypassing the entire system of checks and balances that kept pilots alive. By the time the adhesive began to set, the bypass line looked pristine. To the naked eye, the fix was invisible. As he wiped the excess residue with a rag soaked in solvent, Rusty looked up at the Spectre bolt's dark cockpit. He had just turned America's most advanced fighter into a laboratory experiment. He checked his watch. 3:15 a.m. The inspectors would be back in an hour. He closed the access panel, turned the fasteners until they clicked, and walked out into the desert night. The shortcut was locked in. The fate of the plane was no longer in the hands of the engineers. It was at the mercy of a 30-cent chemical bond. The 4 a.m. air was thick with the smell of ozone and impending judgment. Silas Grimm, the chief inspector, didn't walk. He prowled. Grimm was a man who lived by the decimal point, a career safety-first hawk who viewed every mechanic with a default setting of suspicion. He carried a heavy, chrome-plated maglite that felt less like a tool and more like a weapon of discovery. As the hangar doors creaked open to admit the first gray light of dawn, Rusty stood by his workbench, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, his hands buried deep in his pockets to hide the chemical stains on his cuticles. Grim approached the Spectre bolt with a slow, deliberate cadence. He didn't look at the sleek wings or the intimidating silhouette. He went straight for the guts. He climbed the maintenance stand, his boots clanging on the metal, and thrust his upper body into the open engine nacelle. The beam of his flashlight cut through the shadows, a surgical white light that danced over the fuel lines, the wiring harnesses, and the titanium housing of Engine 2. Rusty watched the back of Grim's neck, waiting for the shout, the whistle, the end of his career. The light stopped. It sat, unmoving, on the exact junction of the secondary bypass line, the spot where the C400 adhesive was currently curing into a hard, glass-like shell. Rusty held his breath until his lungs burned. From this angle, if the light hit the seam at just the right degree, the translucent shimmer of the sunny, illegal bond would glow like a neon sign. Grim leaned in closer, his magnifying glass clicking against the titanium. The silence in the hangar was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the base power grid. For 10 agonizing seconds, the future of the Spectre bolt hung on the refractive index of a tank repair compound. "Miller," Grim's voice echoed out of the engine cavity, hollow and metallic. "This seal, the spec said it was showing microfractures during the Friday stress test. It looks unusually clean." "Wiped it down with grade A solvent, Silas," Rusty replied, his voice a calculated monotone. "Wanted to make sure you had a clear view of the seat." Grim grunted, the light lingering for one more heartbeat before flicking away toward the exhaust nozzle. "Humph. Just make sure the paperwork matches the metal. If this bird drops a bolt over the Potomac, it's my neck in the noose, not Blackwell's." As Grim climbed down, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. It just settled into the floorboards. The watchdog had missed the scent. But the touch clean seal was now a ticking clock. "Before we witness the screaming metal of the takeoff, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you?" At 6:30 a.m., the desert air still held a pre-dawn chill, but the tarmac was already shimmering with latent heat. The XF-22 Spectre bolt, a dark arrow against the bruised purple sky, sat poised on runway 4. Dr. Thorne watched from the observation tower, a knot of dread tightening in his gut, while Blackwell and General Hardaway stood on the viewing platform, their faces grim, expectant. This wasn't a test flight. It was a gamble for the future of air superiority. Inside the cockpit, Cade Flash Holloway ran through his final checks. The HUD glowed green, the readouts were nominal, and the engines, even at idle, hummed with barely contained power. He advanced the throttles. The Spectre bolt bucked forward, a beast straining at a leash. The twin Pratt and Whitney turbines inhaled tons of air per second, compressing it, igniting it, and vomiting out a white-hot torrent of controlled violence. The roar was deafening, a physical blow that vibrated through the very bones of the base. The brakes released. The Spectre bolt surged, a black blur accelerating down the runway. Holloway's helmet pressed him deep into his seat as the G-forces built. In less than 20 seconds, the aircraft hit rotation speed. The nose pitched up, precise and deliberate, and the Spectre bolt clawed its way into the sky. It wasn't just flying, it was defying gravity with contempt. From the ground, it was a silent, lethal ballerina, its stealth geometry cutting through the air with an almost unnatural grace. "Gear up!" Holloway's voice crackled over the comms, calm and confident. "Engines at 90%, climbing through 5,000 feet. Rusty stood with a headset clamped to his ears, staring up at the disappearing vapor trail. He didn't see beauty. He saw pressure. He saw the rapidly thinning atmosphere and the inexorable climb of the engine's internal temperatures. "Passing 10,000 feet, Holloway reported. The Spectre bolt was a speck now, angling steeply towards the stratosphere. Afterburners engaged for mock transition. The ground shook again, a delayed echo of the Spectre bolt punching through the sound barrier. The telemetry screens in the trailer flickered with a torrent of data. Airspeed, altitude, fuel flow. Everything was green, stable, perfect. Except for one number Rusty was fixated on: the internal temperature of Engine 2's bypass section. It was rising, slowly, steadily, past the safety thresholds of the C400 adhesive. 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet, approaching Mach 1.5. Holloway's voice was now tinged with a slight strain of exertion. But the plane was performing flawlessly. The Spectre bolt was doing what it was designed to do: dominate the sky. But in the deep recesses of Engine 2, the heat continued its silent, relentless climb. The composite bond, unseen and unchecked, was beginning to soften. The clock was ticking, not in seconds, but in degrees Celsius. At 48,000 feet, the Spectre bolt was no longer a machine. It was a pressurized vessel holding back an inferno. The Mach meter ticked toward 1.8 comma, and the skin of the aircraft was hot enough to char wood. Inside the cockpit, the first sign of the end wasn't a light, but a smell. The acrid, sweet stench of cooked chemicals seeping through the vents. Then came the shudder. It was a violent, erratic kick that threw Holloway's head against the canopy. "Ghost 1 has a massive vibration in Engine 2. Holloway grunted, his voice strained under the G-load. "Master caution is back. I'm seeing fuel pressure fluctuations. It's tearing itself apart." In the control tower, the telemetry board turned into a sea of crimson. The bypass temperature had hit 1,300 degrees Celsius, well past the point where Rusty's illegal bond would have turned into a liquid slurry. General Hardaway slammed a fist on the console. "Thorne, what is failing? Is it the turbine blades?" Dr. Thorne stood frozen, his eyes darting across the sensor arrays. "The math doesn't make sense. The seal should have disintegrated minutes ago. It shouldn't be holding at all." Rusty stepped forward, his face the color of industrial ash. He knew that every second he stayed silent, the vibration was widening the gap in that bypass line. He knew that the C400 was currently a bubbling vapor, and the only thing keeping the plane in the sky was the sheer force of the airflow pinning the seal in place. But the moment Holloway banked, that force would shift. "It's the seal," Rusty's voice cut through the room, cracking the professional veneer of the tower. He grabbed the comms mic from a startled technician. "Flash, this is Miller. Listen to me. Engine 2 is held together by an unrated composite. If you keep the throttles pinned, it's going to ignite in 10 seconds. The tower went deathly silent. Blackwell's jaw dropped. Hardaway spun around, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and confusion. "Miller, what the hell are you talking about?" Holloway's voice came through the static, edged with panic. "I bypassed the titanium seat with C400 tank bond," Rusty barked, ignoring the hands reaching for him. "It's melting, Flash. You have to throttle back Engine 2 to idle immediately." If you try to maintain Mach, the heat will atomize the fuel line. You need to cold soak the engine. Descend to 20,000 feet, keep the nose at 0 degrees, and let the ambient air cool the nacelle. Do not, I repeat, do not, engage the secondary pumps. The Spectre bolt decelerated with a jarring lurch. On the monitors, the airspeed dropped precipitously. Holloway was now a glider pilot in a $200 million lawn dart. The vibration remained, a low, ominous growl. But the temperature spike slowed. For the next 5 minutes, the air in the tower was too thick to breathe. Rusty stood his ground, a man who had traded his career for a pilot's life, watching the digital dot on the radar descend toward the safety of the desert floor. The XFF-22 Spectre bolt didn't land so much as it surrendered to the earth. When the tires bit the tarmac, a plume of blue smoke erupted from the wheel wells, and as the aircraft taxied toward Hangar 4, the right engine nacelle was visible to everyone, a blackened, heat-warped husk of scorched titanium. The Ghost was bleeding hydraulic fluid, and the smell of charred chemical adhesive trailed behind it like a funeral shroud. Holloway popped the canopy before the engines had even fully stopped, gasping for the desert air, his flight suit soaked in sweat. He didn't look at the generals. He looked at the ground, knowing he had just ridden a miracle home. The investigation began before the turbines had finished their final, mournful whine. Silas Grimm was there with his calipers and his clipboard, but he didn't need them. The evidence was dripping off the bypass line in translucent, hardened stalactites. In the debriefing room, the air was cold enough to crack bone. Cyrus Blackwell sat in the corner, his legal team already whispering about gross negligence, while General Hardaway stood like a statue of judgment. Rusty Miller didn't wait for the accusations. He stood at the head of the table, his grease-stained hands resting on the mahogany surface, an alien presence in a room of polished silver and pressed wool. "I did what was necessary to meet your deadline," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You asked for a plane that could fly by Monday. I gave you one. The engineers told you it was impossible. The supply chain told you it was impossible. I'm the only one who told you yes, and I'm the only reason that pilot is still breathing." He wasn't rewarded with a medal, and he wasn't hauled off to prison. The military brass realized a terrifying truth. Rusty Miller knew the Spectre bolt better than the men who had designed it. They couldn't fire him, but they couldn't let him touch a wrench again. Rusty was moved to a windowless office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, given the title of Senior Training Consultant. His job was simple: to take every safety manual in the Air Force and rewrite them using his shortcut as the primary example of what a machine can endure and what a man should never risk. The Spectre bolt eventually went into mass production, becoming the undisputed king of the skies and the primary deterrent that held the Soviet line for a decade. It won the war without ever firing a shot in anger. But every pilot who climbed into that cockpit did so under a new set of protocols born from the Miller incident. They flew with the knowledge that beneath the billion-dollar sensors and the exotic stealth coatings, the difference between a hero and a catastrophe is often just 30 cents worth of glue and the hubris of a man who thinks he can outsmart the heat.